You are listening to the Political Periscope, a weekly podcast brought to you by Radio WNET. Interviews on international politics, security, geopolitics, economy, and more. Every Thursday at 7 p.m.
Today's guest of the Political Periscope is Ilya Ponomarev, member of the Executive Council of the Congress of People's Deputies and former member of Russian Parliament from 2007 to 2016.
Political Periscope.
What will take place next week in Warsaw?
It would be a second Congress of People's Deputies, the convention of the shadow Russian parliament.
Shadow Russian parliament, well, it sounds unusual. What's the main aim of this Congress and who will come?
Yeah, actually, to say exact, all of the Russian politics actually happening in shadows. So we are vice versa, we are in the spotlight. So you would be present, many other people would be present. But in fact, speaking seriously, it's an alternative to the current Russian authorities. It was in November when it was 59 at that time former members of Russian parliament of different times got together next to Warsaw in Yablonna and decided to create the proper parliament. Because the current parliament in Russia was actually never elected. So formally it was elected, but in fact it was elected illegally after the legally changed constitution with the participation of the occupied territory, so it was never recognized as a legitimate Russian parliament. These 59 guys, they were legitimately elected. They were recognized as a proper parliamentarians, and they want to restore the proper parliamentarism in Russia.
Do you think other countries will recognize this alternative parliament?
No, of course they will. It takes a little bit of time, and I think that originally it would be Poland and Ukraine, the two main countries which are fighting against the aggression and which are closely watching what's going on in the Congress, and then others would follow the suit.
So far, do you have support of any country?
No, but we experience very strong support from Ukraine. That's where some of our people reside, and we help Ukraine to fight the aggression. Many Russians are fighting right now in the front lines in Ukraine, but also we feel very strong sympathy from the Polish government, and that's why I think that Ukraine and Poland would, as in all of this war, will be together in the recognition as well.
You mentioned Russians fighting in Ukraine. Are there many Russians fighting there? How many units? How many people?
In general, the assessment of the military command of Ukraine that it's approximately 4,000 Russian nationals which are fighting right now within the ranks of Ukrainian army. They are scattered across different units, so they are not consolidated all together in one place. But the largest unit that exists is called Legion of Free Russia. It consists of 2 battalions, and so significant portion of those Russians who are in Ukraine, they are within this unit.
Speaking of Legion of Free Russia, a few weeks ago there was a press conference in Warsaw about cooperation of Legion of Free Russia and so-called Civic Council. Do you cooperate with them also, with this Civic Council, with other Russian opposition organizations in Europe?
No, I think that you are confusing because there is another division which is way smaller than the Legion of Free Russia, but also it's a very capable division of very committed fighters. It's called Russian Voluntary Corps, and they are cooperating with the Civic Corps. That's a kind of political organization of Russians who live in Poland, and probably you were referring to that cooperation.
Yes, but, you're right.
Yeah, but in general, we are trying, obviously, all to keep in touch because among people who are actually fighting, there are no contradictions. among politicians and within the ranks of Russian opposition, obviously, there is a lot of competition, with different groups, and some people like each other, some people don't like each other. It's very bad, but there are a lot of fights. But those who are in the front lines, they don't waste their time arguing with each other. They just fight.
Mentioning opposition, there are such well-known names as Khodorkovsky or Kasparov, also Navalny, who's in prison, and you seem to be one of the emerging leaders also of opposition being recognized in the world. Do you see a prospect of cooperation to change the regime in Russia between all those factions?
Look, I think that we are doomed to work together at the end of the day. Some people are more inclined to cooperate, some people less inclined to cooperate. Different people, they have different personal objectives and personal ambitions. And that obviously is not helping, when we are talking about the creation of a unified force. But again, as I am saying, at the end of the day, the bottom line is who is ready to act, who is ready to fight, and who is ready just to talk. There are a lot of talkers. There are not so many doers. And that's why I do believe that at the end of the day, everybody who is doing things, they would be united, and we have one common enemy whom we are confronting, and we need to prevail, and we will prevail. And I think that among many names that you mentioned, Khodorkovsky in general is my very old friend, and I think that there are no contradictions with him whatsoever. With Gary, we had a lot of debates because Gary is more, historically was more focused on supporting Russian immigration outside Russia, and I was always saying that I am very much against people leaving Russia, that I want them to stay in Russia and take the fight there. We had the debates, but I think that right now everybody understands that we need to be on the same platform, and that's where it's going to.
But you yourself were forced to leave Russia. Also, many people who want to change the regime, who are against the regime, they just fled Russia, especially after the first wave of mobilization. How to work in such conditions where people who are against Putin, they just flee the country because they are not able to stay there? Is there enough internal centrifugal force in Russia to make the change?
Look, people are different. And they have different fears and different hopes and different aspirations of life. And there are people who are, I wouldn't say like professional revolutionaries, but at least they are political activists which committed themselves to political fight. And obviously they are in the spotlight of the oppression. And for them to escape the prison, I think is the right thing to do because, Alexei Navalny is in prison, he is a hero, but how can he participate right now in the fight? He cannot, because he is in prison and he is a hostage. And he can be killed anytime there in prison. And I do think that, it was a historic and heroic move of him to return to Russia. But at the end of the day, it would have been way more productive if he would stay outside and lead the fight. But it's a totally different story of people who just live in Russia because they are uncomfortable there, because they have certain fears, but which are not immediately oppressed. And with those people, I obviously think that it would be way better if they would at least try to put up some fight. Then, if, something bad happens and, again, the security forces are coming after them, they can leave. But firstly, try to do something. And there are people in Russia who are right now joining the partisan movement and who are organizing attacks against this regime and who do the actual resistance movement. It exists, it's growing, and its numbers increasing. Some people move into Ukraine and they join the resistance to the aggression in Ukraine, and they join Ukrainian army to fight Putinists. That's what I call the resistance.
But without critical mass in the nation, there will be no change. And do you think that it is possible to ever arrive at this level?
I think that we already passed the point where we cared about, the masses that would make the change through an electoral process or something like this. We are right now in the dictatorship situation, when a lot of things are decided by professional revolutionaries and the elites who cannot sustain to keep themselves within the system that was created. So to achieve this split within the elites and to apply pressure on behalf of revolutionaries, that's what needs to be done. Right now, a lot of, unfortunately, Russian opposition people, they say, okay, so we just support Ukraine and we can help refugees and whatever, different humanitarian causes. And that's great that people are helping. But our primary duty is to support the Ukrainian army, because that's the current main revolutionary force in Russia. That's the agent of the change. And as Ukrainian army is successful, the closer the actual revolution and the change of the regime would be in the country.
2 weeks ago, you were in Brussels at the conference Imperial Russia, Conquest, Genocide, Colonization, Prospects of Decolonization and Deimperialization. What do you want? Which Russia you want? Whole Russia with changed regime, with changed government, or Russia split in many independent sovereign states?
I want Russia where people prosper. That's the ultimate goal. And how that would look like, that's for the people to decide. Like making predictions, forecasts. I do not anticipate Russia to collapse in gazillion different small pieces. I don't think that's feasible. I don't think that would happen. I think that we may face certain of the national republics to split away. I think that there is a very high chance that Chechnya, for example, would go, maybe it would be like 2-3 others, national republics, which may decide to leave. But I don't think that means the collapse of the country in general. Because even if we see all of the national republics go, which I think is completely improbable, then still looking on the map, you would see more or less the same Russia as you see it now, with little bit of holes here and there, but in general it would be the same, because at the end of the day 80% of people in Russia, they are ethnically Russians. And that's why I don't think that the disintegration is a realistic scenario. We can achieve deimperialization of the country and demilitarization of the country without splitting it into a lot of different small pieces. And anyway, it shouldn't be artificially pursued, not in one way or another way. Our government would respect the desire of particular nations to go away if they want to. But it needs to be their decision, not a decision which would be dictated on them from somebody at the top. And we need to say that Russian Federation as the country would no longer exist. It would be a new Russia. And this new Russia needs to be recreated by the regions. Each region should make a conscious decision. Yes, we want to be together with others. We want to delegate certain part of our prerogatives, of our authority to the central level. Clearly define what this authority is, and with that to create a new country. It's no longer like Boris Yeltsin was saying, take as much sovereignty as you want to, but being a Tsar, who is delegating part of his sovereignty, part of his authority to somebody there at the bottom. No, that's not how it would work. It would be the other way around. It would be people at the bottom, ordinary people, regional people who would say, okay, take something because we want, say, common defense, common infrastructure, common education, other stuff.
You mentioned nations, other nations, but it is possible that even ethnic Russians who live in other parts of Russia than this, I would say, core European part of Russia, they can create some political nations, even if they are still ethnically Russians, like it happened in Spanish Empire, for instance. The main difference is the metropolis is not overseas.
I don't know how well you know Russia. I know it really well. I traveled a lot in my country. country. I lived in many regions myself. I can say whether I see at least theoretical chances for Russians to create political nations besides Moscow is Siberia, maybe Urals, but definitely not Central Russia. Central Russia is probably the most conservative, the most inert part of the country. It's like Midwest in the United States, something like this. It's the most stable and traditional society as you would see in the country in general, this very center. And that's why I don't think that any significant initiative would come from that part. I do believe in very free and liberated people of Siberia, because also it's a problem that in the Center Russia, there was this slavery until 1861. It was abolished only in the second half of the 19th century, but there was no slavery in Siberia, no time. And it was always populated by very free and dynamic people. So that's where I think the main pressure, the wind of change would come from.
Well, and many prisoners, especially from Poland, sent by Imperial Russia to Siberia.
Many prisoners, you're absolutely right, but also who is the most free in the autocratic state is the prisoner. And you see many nations on this planet which were created by these prisoners. Take example of Australia or New Zealand, or even if we look at the United States of America, that's also a significant part of the population, different people who were rejected by their societies.
We are concluding 9th year of the war of Russia against Ukraine, and we are very close to the first anniversary of this full-scale invasion on 24th of February 2022. What you're doing, your revolution, is a part of this war, will be a part of this war, but we are waiting. When will it happen? Are you waiting for Ukrainian victory, or are you going to act before to support this victory?
Oh, look, we're definitely not waiting. Again, unfortunately, many of Russians do wait, but not us. We want to be part of this victory. We are doing everything possible to speed it up. And our people are spilling their blood alongside with Ukrainians in the front lines. And we have people who already perished during this fight. And there were people who were killed by security forces inside Russia, being part of the partisans movement. And obviously we have also victims who died fighting next to Bakhmut against Wagner and in other locations. It's the war. But we are definitely not waiting. I don't think that there is something which we can do artificially to create a revolutionary in Russia. I think that the trigger for the revolution would be outside our realm, outside our reach. As I think that most likely it would be a major military defeat in Ukraine. But definitely we are preparing ourselves to make the final push when the situation would start to collapse. And I think that one of the important factors right now, obviously, is to consolidate the public opinion outside Russia, within the foreign governments, so that they would be no longer afraid of the words regime change. They would recognize that the regime change in Russia is something which is imminent and take part in the planning of this future Russia, which would be free, democratic, and safe for all.
You wrote a book along with Greg Stibben. I had a chance to speak with him. Does Putin have to die? So, does he?
My answer is pretty obvious. We are working on this every day.
What will happen with Putin? What will happen with other members of this regime? What will happen with FSB or KGB, because it's just changed name? What is the plan?
Well, I think that speaking about Putin, it would be great if he would die as the decision of the International Tribunal, and that he would be hanged as many of the Nazi war criminals were hanged in 1946. But I do think that most likely he will not survive to that time, because most likely his own inner circle would get to him before that. But others would definitely be tried, and that's part of our political program. In the Congress of People's Deputies, we support the initiative of creating international tribunal on the war crimes, by the way, not only in Ukraine, but in general war crimes of Putin's regime. That would include Chechnya and Georgia and Syria and unfortunately other places. But at the end of the day, we are not talking about personalities. We are talking about a system. We need to demolish the system. We need to disassemble it. We need to recreate a new one. We need to create a system where this imperialism revenge would not be possible, where Russia would become an integral part of the global community and would never be able to create another aggressive imperialist war as what we saw recently.
A bit of provocative question. Is Russia a part of European civilization? Because there are many roots of today's Russia which are definitely not European, even opposed to European.
Oh, look, definitely we are. Also, I think it's a matter of fact that the more you go eastwards, the more infusions you would see from other cultures and from other nations in the countries which stay there. For example, in Ukraine, you would also see a lot of influence and infusions from Turks. From Ottomans, right? In Russians, you would see a lot of influence from Mongol Tatars and that Asian civilization, but it's not the major influence. When you look at the mirror, you see not an Asian face, you see a European face. When we are talking about a religion, we are based on the same Bible. When we are talking about a culture, we again read the same books, we go to the same movies, we listen to the same music. So obviously Russian civilization is the part of the European civilization. I would say more, it's a Christian civilization, Abrahamic civilization. And my overarching view is that at the end of the day it would be a global Northern Union, which is based on the same ethical values of Renaissance and on this one book, who is the foundation of everything. And I'm not talking here about the religion. So many people are atheists or agnostic, whatever, but it's still our ethical platform is formulated there, and everybody who respects this ethical platform, they would live in one society.
However, I can see many differences in mentality between Russians and Europeans. You have, of course, there are part of Russians who are democratic, but there are no real democratic traditions in Russia, like never in the history, except maybe Novgorod, but there was a genocide in Novgorod. It was the first Russian genocide. It will take a lot of work to change, for example, this part.
No, I think that again, political systems and democracy being one of them is coming and going. And in different parts of the history, in different times, the situation was totally different. And at the end of the day, the civilization which was born in Kiev and Rus, and that was the branches which then moved to the territory of modern-day Russia, twisted, like whatever. But that was an ancient European civilization, and it started even before things started in Poland, for example. It's more ancient. And you mentioned absolutely correctly the tradition of Novgorod Republic, Republic, which was demolished and assassinated, massacred by Ivan the Terrible. But that was the place which was called Northern Athens, which was a tradition of direct democracy like it was in ancient Greece. So I think that a lot of traditions are there. But again, the ethical platform is more important. The reformation, which Russia never went through, is important. And creation of the political system which would incentivize certain behavior on behalf of Russians is the paramount importance. I think that in 1993, for example, was one of the major mistakes which was made by the West altogether, which allowed Boris Yeltsin to assassinate the parliament. And then in 1996 to falsify the elections. We actually, I think at that time, we were moving very much at peer, which was happening in Poland. But in Poland, Wałęsa, which was also very spontaneous leader, very charismatic, but not very organized, he stepped back when Kwasniewski won the elections. In Russia, with the consolidated position of the West, they preferred to take the elections away from Zyuganov, who would be very much the same as Kwasniewski in Poland. So that pendulum, which was supposed to start swaying from left to right and from right to left, it never started. And that pre-programmed accession of such leader as Vladimir Putin. I think that we shouldn't make this mistake anymore, and that's exactly why we have created this Congress of People's Deputies, so that we, from the very beginning, we are creating a political system which is neutral from those who managed to come to power.
Next week there will be the Congress of People's Deputies, and there will be very important visit of the President of the United States, Joe Biden, to Poland. 3 days long visit, which is very long.
Yes, 3 days Congress, 3 days visit. So we are very thankful for American president that he took into account when the Congress would take place, and we really welcome him with the new Russian authorities. That would be our first official political contact. No, seriously speaking, I think that it's not an accident that President Biden is coming in these days. I think there would be a face-to-face meeting with President Zelensky. I'm guessing here, it's no information, so I'm guessing. I think it's a very high probability that Biden would decide to go into Ukraine at the end of his visit. Again, it's the anniversary of the full-scale invasion. I think that the important decisions would be made in terms of more military support to Ukraine. I think that right now there are a lot of disputes on the future restoration of Ukraine's economy and infrastructure. But by the way, also here, these issues are very closely interlinked with what would happen in Russia, because no matter what, the restoration of Ukraine would require at least 500 billion US. And where is this money coming from? Definitely it would not be sponsored by European or American taxpayers. I think that at least 80% of these funds would come from Russia. So to make sure that they are coming, you need to actually think what would be the next administration in Russia and how to create a proper relationship there. And by the way, if Russia would collapse into many different pieces, then who would pay the reparations? Tatarstan would say, okay, it was not our decision, come to Moscow. And Moscow doesn't have oil and gas to repay all those compensations. So I think that's also one of the factors that we should take into account. Americans right now, I think, are way more shy than Poles, because I think that here in Eastern Europe, Polish government, the government of the Baltic states, the government of Czech Republic, many others, they do understand that the future of Russia is our mutual interest. We need to decide collectively, because it's a question of our joint security, it's the question of our joint prosperity, if it's a question of our joint stability. For Americans, it's a more theoretical thing, and they are way more afraid that if they would interfere at this moment, that Putin would threaten them with nuclear arms, with whatever. So they kind of very reluctant to talk about the regime change in the country, but they would inevitably have an important voice there. And we need to start this discussion. And I very much hope that during Biden's visit, this question, maybe not in public, but unofficially would be on the agenda as well.
I imagine that in case of collapse and split of Russian Federation, there would be some treaty, so maybe those reparations would be also split, because we cannot really say that Tatarstan is not responsible, as we cannot say that it's only Putin that's responsible for war. Would you agree? Russians, in a big part, are responsible, not only Putin.
No, I fully agree with this sentiment. But again, as a practical politician, I would say if the regions would start to split away, they would deny their responsibility as the state entity. Moral responsibility, that's another thing. But responsibility as a state entity, it would be different. And I would draw your attention to one very extreme example, which would highlight the situation. Okay, Tatarstan was loyal. Minnikhanov, the leader of Tatarstan, and Tatar elites were loyal to Putin. Let's look at Chechnya. So Chechnya was fighting for its independence, and right now they have internationally recognized shadow government led by Ahmed Zakayev, which obviously were against the war from the very beginning. But at the same time, it was Kadyrov who was within Chechnya and who was for the war and was supporting Putin's position. And okay, so the war lost. Chechnya is independent. Okay, so what you would do? You would come to Ahmed and say, Mr. Zakayev, Your Excellency, you were all the time against the war. You were even fighting. Your people were dying. Even your people were fighting alongside with Ukrainians. But now you need to have to pay the compensation to Ukrainians instead of spending money on restoration of your nation after the period of the occupation. What would Mr. Zakayev's answer be? I don't think that he would be very enthusiastic in giving a positive answer. And if he would not, then Tatars would do the same. They would say, okay, guys, let's be clear. Either you recognize that we were occupied by Russian Federation, and in this situation, we have no responsibility on the decisions of the Russian Federation, and whatever reparations or whatever, you go to Moscow and talk to them. Don't come to us. We have nothing to do with it. Or they are part of Russia. In this regards, and before everything is compensated and everything, they are staying part of Russia. It's one way or another. It cannot be both. And if we look at where the major national wealth of Russia is, you would see it's Western Siberia, which is national districts. It would be in the same Tatarstan and Bashkiria. So it would be rather small exclusions when it would be Russian territories where oil and gas and whatever is.
Let's get back to the US. Do you have any contacts, any support from there?
Oh, obviously, we have a lot of contacts.
I mean, like official level.
We have a lot of contacts on the official level, very much so. The question is, when you're saying about support, no, United States did not make a decision that they want to be part of the regime change in Russia. And that's exactly what I was saying about. There is a faction in their administration which understands that they need to be, and that they need to pay attention, and that they need to think about the future of the continent. And it's a joint cause. But currently, the majority of the administration are simply afraid. They're afraid of Putin, they're afraid of nuclear arms, they're afraid of everything, and their position is pretty simple, that this is the war which has been led by Ukraine. Let Ukrainians think about it. We will support the Ukrainian decision, but Ukraine should lead and that's their position. I think that maybe it's the correct approach. I think it should be more proactive in this regards. Okay, they would lead, but at least you need to discuss what's happening. And I already read numerous articles in the American and in British press where people are openly saying, okay, we are paying for this war, so we need to have a say in the outcome of the war. But they're still nowhere close to a modern-day Tehran or Yalta, where world leaders sit together and decide the future of Germany. But I think we will be coming to this point at one day or another.
To end, what will be the outcome of this war?
And the outcome of this war would be a free and independent Ukraine. I think it would be a free and democratic Russia. I think it would be a more stable peace. And I think that in the long run, everybody would benefit from the outcome. We just need to stay firm. We don't need to trade our principles. We need to be committed and we need to be united. And we will prevail.
So, no another Minsk agreement?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it's feasible. If you read the recent polls in Ukraine, there was one prepared specifically for Munich Security Conference. It was published a couple of days ago. People were asked, okay, if Putin would apply nuclear arms, would you still fight? And 89% were saying, yes, we will, even after the nuclear arms. And also saying, would you compromise on the borders of 2021? So when part of Donbass and Crimea are still occupied, but Putin is getting out of all the territories that were captured in 2022. And 85% were saying, no, we will not compromise. So Ukrainian society is absolutely committed, despite all the hardships, power outages, human losses, missiles, bombs, and whatever, we are committed. And I'm saying here we, because we free Russians and Ukrainians, we stand together. And again, we will prevail.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This was The Political Periscope. The podcast is released every Thursday at 7 p.m.